Have you ever wondered what happens when humanity breaks through the barriers that war creates? When a single act of courage bridges the gap between enemy and friend in ways that seem impossible? What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, sacrifice, and the power of human connection during our darkest hours. Picture this. It's the scorching summer of 1943 in Louisiana. The air is thick with humidity and tension as thousands of German prisoners of war work alongside American civilians in the cotton fields and sugar plantations. These men, captured from Raml's legendary Afrika Korps, now find themselves thousands of miles from home in the heart of enemy territory. But this isn't just another war story about prisoners and guards. This is the extraordinary account of how one German soldier's split-second decision would forever change an American family and prove that even in war's darkest moments, the human heart recognizes no uniform, no flag, no artificial boundaries between us and them. The story I'm about to tell you has been buried in Louisiana archives for over 80 years. It involves a young German medic named Klaus Mueller, a Louisiana farm family struggling to survive wartime labor shortages, and a rescue so dramatic that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every moment of terror and triumph actually happened. And the consequences of what unfolded on that August afternoon in 1943 would ripple through generations. Before we dive into this incredible tale, let me paint you a picture of just how impossible this situation really was. Louisiana in 1943 was home to more than 40 prisoner of war camps housing over 20,000 German soldiers. These weren't hardened Nazi fanatics, but young men conscripted from across occupied Europe who found themselves fighting for a cause many of them never believed in. They arrived in Louisiana after witnessing the collapse of German hopes in North Africa, disillusioned and homesick, yet treated with a humanity that surprised even them. The Budro family had been farming sugar cane in Iberia Parish for 3 generations. Henry Budro was 52 years old, his weathered hands testimony to decades of working Louisiana soil. His wife Marie ran their household with the fierce efficiency of a woman who had raised 5 children while helping manage a working farm. Their eldest son Paul was somewhere in the Pacific fighting Japanese forces. Their second son Thomas had been killed at Normandy just 2 months earlier. Their youngest, 12-year-old Anton had become the man of the house far too early, working alongside German prisoners to keep the family farm running. The labor shortage created by war had forced the Budro family into an arrangement they never could have imagined. Every morning at dawn, a truck would arrive carrying 6 German prisoners and 2 American guards. These former enemies would work side by side with Henry and Anton, harvesting cane under the blazing Louisiana sun. The irony was not lost on anyone. German soldiers, who months earlier had been shooting at American boys, now helped put food on American tables. Klaus Mueller was 24 years old, a medical corpsman who had been captured during the final collapse of German resistance in Tunisia. Unlike many of his fellow prisoners who had embraced Nazi ideology, Klaus came from a family of doctors in Bavaria who had always valued healing over harming. His father had been quietly opposed to the war. His mother had hidden Jewish neighbors in their basement until they could escape to Switzerland. Klaus carried their moral compass with him even into captivity, seeing his medical training as a sacred duty that transcended nationality. The relationship between the Budro family and their German workers had evolved from suspicious tolerance to grudging respect over the months they worked together. Henry noticed that Klaus always volunteered for the most dangerous tasks, operated farm machinery with careful precision, and treated the family's old mule with a gentleness that spoke of someone who understood the value of working animals. Marie observed how Klaus would save portions of his lunch to feed stray cats that wandered onto the farm, how he fashioned small toys from corn husks for Anton when the boy seemed particularly sad about his brothers. Anton had initially been terrified of the German prisoners. His teacher had filled his head with stories about Nazi brutality. His mother had warned him to keep his distance from the enemy soldiers. But Klaus was different from the monsters described in wartime propaganda. He spoke broken English with a soft accent, smiled when Anton successfully completed difficult tasks, and once spent his break time helping the boy repair a broken bicycle chain. The barrier between enemy and friend was slowly dissolving through daily acts of ordinary kindness. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Sugar cane harvesting involved razor-sharp machetes, heavy machinery that could crush limbs without warning, and chemical treatments that could blind or burn anyone careless enough to mishandle them. The prisoners had been given basic safety training, but accidents were common. Just the previous month, a prisoner at a neighboring farm had lost 3 fingers to a cane press. Everyone understood that farm work during wartime carried risks that went far beyond enemy bullets. Klaus had established himself as the unofficial medical officer for both prisoners and family members working the Budro farm. When Henry suffered a deep gash from a machete, Klaus cleaned and bandaged the wound with professional skill. When one of the other prisoners developed signs of heat exhaustion, Klaus insisted on rest breaks and increased water rations. His medical knowledge had earned him respect from the American guards, who relied on his expertise when injuries occurred miles from the nearest hospital. The morning of August 15th started like any other. The prisoners arrived before sunrise to beat the oppressive heat that would make afternoon work unbearable. Anton had been assigned to help Klaus maintain the mechanical cane press, a massive contraption of gears and rollers that crushed harvested cane to extract its precious juice. The machine was temperamental, requiring constant adjustment and cleaning to prevent dangerous jams that could shut down operations for hours. Klaus had noticed something troubling about the press that morning. The safety guards were loose, vibrating in ways that suggested imminent mechanical failure. He had mentioned his concerns to the American guard supervisor, but wartime production pressures meant that equipment ran until it broke completely. Stopping for preventive maintenance was a luxury they couldn't afford when every day of delay meant potential crop loss worth hundreds of dollars. As the morning progressed, Klaus's uneasiness grew. He watched Anton work with the casual fearlessness of youth, reaching into spaces that made the experienced medic's stomach clench with worry. The boy was quick and capable, but he lacked the hard-won caution that kept adult workers safe around dangerous machinery. Klaus found himself positioning his body between Anton and the most hazardous parts of the operation, ready to intervene if something went wrong. The other prisoners had noticed Klaus's protective behavior toward the American boy. Some teased him good-naturedly about becoming soft, about caring too much for the enemy's children. Others understood the impulse. Many of them had younger brothers at home, and Anton's eager helpfulness reminded them of siblings they might never see again. In the strange mathematics of war, protecting this one American child felt like honoring all the children whose lives had been disrupted by the conflict. Henry Budro had been watching the interaction between Klaus and his son with mixed emotions. Part of him appreciated the Germans' obvious care for Anton's safety. Another part struggled with the cognitive dissonance of seeing an enemy soldier treat his child with paternal concern. The war had taught him to hate Germans as abstract entities, but daily exposure to Klaus and the other prisoners had revealed them as individuals with their own fears, hopes, and moral codes. Marie Budro had her own complicated feelings about the German prisoners working their land. She had lost one son to German bullets, had another fighting Germans in the Pacific, yet found herself packing extra food for Klaus when she noticed him giving portions of his meals to younger, hungrier prisoners. His quiet dignity and obvious decency challenged her preconceptions about the enemy in ways that left her emotionally exhausted. The mechanical failure that would change everything began as a subtle vibration in the cane press around 10:30 that morning. Klaus felt it first, his medically trained senses attuned to variations in rhythm and sound that might indicate problems. He called for a work stoppage to investigate, but the American guard supervisor was under pressure to meet daily quotas and overruled his concerns. Production would continue until lunch break, then they would examine the machinery if problems persisted. Klaus reluctantly resumed his position at the press, but his attention remained focused on the increasingly erratic behavior of the massive machine. The vibration was growing stronger, accompanied by grinding sounds that suggested metal components were beginning to fail catastrophically. He tried to keep Anton away from the most dangerous areas, but the boy's job required him to clear jams and adjust settings that put him directly in harm's way. The other prisoners had begun to notice Klaus's growing agitation. His normally calm demeanor had been replaced by obvious tension that made everyone around the machine nervous. Even the American guards sensed that something was wrong, though they couldn't identify the specific source of danger. The morning air, already thick with humidity, seemed to carry an additional weight of impending crisis that made everyone's movements more cautious. What happened next would test every assumption about loyalty, duty, and the bonds that can form between supposed enemies. The mechanical failure that Klaus had been dreading was about to unfold with devastating speed, and in that moment of crisis, the young German medic would face a choice that would define not just his own character, but the very meaning of humanity in wartime. The decision he made in the next few seconds would prove that heroism recognizes no uniform, that courage speaks a universal language, and that sometimes the most profound acts of loyalty occur between people who are supposed to be enemies. To be enemies. The catastrophic failure began with a sound that Klaus would remember for the rest of his life. A grinding shriek of metal tearing against metal as the main drive shaft of the cane press began to separate from its housing. The massive machine, weighing nearly 3 tons, started to shudder violently as internal components that had been stressed beyond their limits finally surrendered to the inevitable forces of mechanical destruction. Anton was standing directly beside the press when the first bolt sheared off, ricocheting past his head with the velocity of a rifle bullet. The boy looked up with confusion rather than fear, his young mind unable to process the magnitude of danger unfolding around him. Klaus saw everything with the heightened perception that crisis brings to trained medical professionals. Time seemed to slow as he calculated angles, trajectories, and the horrifying sequence of events that would unfold in the next few seconds. The American Guard supervisor finally understood what Klaus had been trying to warn them about all morning. He shouted for everyone to clear the area, his voice barely audible over the increasing mechanical chaos. The other prisoners scattered immediately, their survival instincts overriding any concern for production quotas or work assignments. But Anton remained frozen beside the machine, his 12-year-old reflexes no match for the speed of unfolding disaster. Klaus had perhaps 2 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether the American boy lived or died. Every rational calculation told him to follow the other prisoners to safety. He was an enemy soldier, a prisoner of war whose primary obligation was to his own survival. Risking his life for an American child violated every principle of military logic and self-preservation. Yet something deeper than military training, something that connected to his father's medical oath and his mother's courage in hiding Jewish refugees, compelled him toward action rather than escape. The main drive shaft finally separated completely from its housing, sending the massive metal cylinder spinning through the air like a deadly projectile. Anton stood directly in its path, still paralyzed by the overwhelming sensory assault of screaming metal and mechanical destruction. Klaus launched himself forward with the desperate strength of someone who understood that hesitation meant death. His body covered the distance between safety and catastrophe in a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. The impact came with the force of a locomotive. Klaus's body collided with Anton's, just as the drive shaft completed its deadly arc through the space where the boy had been standing. The German medic's momentum carried them both away from the immediate danger zone, but the secondary explosion of machinery components created a storm of metal fragments that turned the air around them into a whirlwind of death. Klaus felt something tear through his shoulder as he shielded Anton with his own body, accepting wounds that would have killed the smaller boy. Henry Budro witnessed the rescue from 30 yards away, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. A German prisoner of war, a man whose countrymen had killed his eldest son, had just risked everything to save Anton's life. The contradiction shattered every assumption Henry had built about enemies and allies, about the nature of good and evil in wartime. He found himself running toward the wreckage not to check on his son first, but to see if the German who had saved him was still alive. The mechanical destruction continued for another 20 seconds as remaining components failed in sequence, each new collapse adding to the chaos of twisted metal and scattered debris. When the violence finally ended, an eerie silence settled over the farm that was broken only by the sound of Henry's boots crunching through metal fragments and Klaus's labored breathing as he struggled to maintain consciousness while still protecting Anton with his body. Marie Budro appeared at the scene with the speed of a mother whose child is in danger. She had been preparing lunch in the farmhouse kitchen when the sounds of mechanical destruction sent her running across the fields without regard for her own safety. What she found challenged everything she thought she knew about the war, about enemies, about the nature of human courage under impossible circumstances. Klaus was bleeding heavily from multiple wounds, his prisoner's uniform torn and soaked with blood from the metal fragments that had found their mark. Yet his first words, spoken in broken English thick with pain and a German accent, were to ask if Anton was hurt. The boy was shaken but miraculously uninjured, protected by the body of a man who had chosen his safety over self-preservation. Marie knelt beside Klaus as he struggled to stay conscious, her hands automatically moving to assess his injuries, with the practical knowledge of someone who had spent decades caring for farm accidents. The American guards reached the scene moments later, their faces reflecting the same confusion and disbelief that had overcome the Budro family. They had been trained to maintain discipline among enemy prisoners, to prevent escapes and maintain security protocols. Nothing in their manual had prepared them for a situation where a German prisoner had risked his life to save an American child. The normal categories of friend and enemy seemed inadequate to describe what they had witnessed. Dr. William Thibodeaux arrived within the hour, summoned by radio from his practice in New Iberia. He was a man who had treated both American civilians and German prisoners throughout the war, maintaining professional neutrality despite his own son's service in the European theater. But what he found at the Budro farm challenged even his experienced medical objectivity. Klaus's injuries were severe enough to threaten his life, yet the German had refused pain medication until he was certain that Anton had been thoroughly examined and declared unharmed. The story of Klaus's heroic rescue spread through the local community with the speed that only extraordinary news can achieve. By evening, neighbors who had never spoken to the Budro family were arriving at their farmhouse to hear first-hand accounts of what had happened. The tale challenged fundamental assumptions about the war, about the nature of their German prisoners, about the possibility of finding humanity in the midst of organized hatred. Word of the incident reached Camp Polk within 24 hours, creating a bureaucratic crisis that no military manual had anticipated. How do you discipline a prisoner of war for saving an American life? How do you maintain security protocols when the enemy has demonstrated loyalty that exceeds that of some allies? The camp commandant found himself facing questions that had no precedent in military law or wartime experience. Klaus spent 3 weeks recovering in the camp hospital, his injuries more serious than initially apparent. The metal fragments had caused internal bleeding that required surgery, and infection threatened to complicate his recovery. During his convalescence, he received visitors that would have been unimaginable under normal circumstances. Henry and Marie Budro came daily, bringing food and updates about farm operations that they discussed as if Klaus were a family member rather than an enemy prisoner. Anton insisted on visiting Klaus despite his parents' initial reluctance. The boy had been deeply affected by the realization that someone had been willing to die for him, and he struggled to understand why a German soldier would make such a sacrifice. Their conversations, conducted in Anton's limited German and Klaus's improving English, created a bond that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. The boy began teaching Klaus American phrases while learning German words in return, their friendship becoming a small act of rebellion against the hatred that surrounded them. The other prisoners at Camp Polk regarded Klaus with a mixture of admiration and concern. His actions had elevated him to heroic status among men who had seen little heroism in their recent military service. Yet some worried that his obvious affection for the American family had made him vulnerable to charges of collaboration or disloyalty to Germany. The complex emotions within the prisoner community reflected the broader confusion about identity and loyalty that war creates in individual human hearts. Local newspapers picked up the story, though military censors heavily edited the accounts to avoid creating propaganda problems. The narrative of a German prisoner risking his life to save an American child was simultaneously inspiring and potentially dangerous if it led to unrealistic expectations about prisoner behavior. Military authorities found themselves balancing the positive publicity against security concerns and the need to maintain proper psychological distance between guards and prisoners. The rescue had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other Louisiana families began viewing their German workers differently, seeing individuals rather than abstractions, human beings capable of both suffering and heroism. The transformation was subtle but significant, creating an environment where genuine relationships could develop between supposed enemies. Some prisoners reported improved treatment from civilian employers who had heard about Klaus's actions. Klaus himself seemed transformed by the experience in ways that went beyond his physical injuries. The man who returned to farm work was quieter, more thoughtful, carrying himself with a dignity that reflected his recognition of what he had chosen in that moment of crisis. He had discovered something about his own character that surprised him, had found reserves of courage and compassion that transcended nationality and military obligation. The mechanical disaster that had nearly claimed Anton's life became a turning point for everyone involved. The Budro family could never again think of Germans as faceless enemies. Klaus could never again see Americans as abstract opponents in a political conflict. The guards could never again maintain the emotional distance that military protocol demanded. In that moment of crisis and courage, the artificial boundaries of war had dissolved, revealing the human connections that exist beneath the uniforms and flags and ideologies that divide us. But Klaus's story was far from over. The heroic rescue that had saved Anton's life would soon create new dangers and challenges that would test the bonds formed in that moment of crisis. Military authorities were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between the German prisoner and the American family. Security protocols were being questioned. And Klaus himself was about to face a choice that would determine whether his act of heroism would be remembered as an inspiration or condemned as something far more complicated and dangerous. The questions began 3 days after Klaus returned to work. Captain Morrison, the camp's intelligence officer, arrived at the Budro farm during the morning shift with a clipboard full of forms and an expression that made everyone nervous. He had received reports about the unusual relationship developing between prisoner number 4847 and the American family he had saved. Military regulations were clear about fraternization between prisoners and civilians, but Klaus's heroic actions had created a situation that existing protocols had never anticipated. Morrison interviewed each family member separately, his questions probing the nature of their interactions with Klaus beyond basic work requirements. Had the prisoner ever asked questions about military installations? Had he shown unusual interest in local transportation networks? Had the family provided him with anything beyond standard work provisions? The interrogation felt like an accusation, transforming Klaus's act of heroism into something suspicious and potentially treasonous. Henry Budro grew increasingly angry as the questioning continued. His son was alive because a German prisoner had chosen courage over self-preservation, yet military bureaucracy was treating that sacrifice as evidence of enemy infiltration. The absurdity of the situation highlighted everything he had come to hate about war's ability to twist human decency into grounds for suspicion. When Morrison suggested that Klaus might have orchestrated the entire incident to gain the family's trust, Henry's restraint finally shattered. The confrontation that followed became legendary among the local farming community. Henry, a man who had never raised his voice to authority figures, told Captain Morrison exactly what he thought of military officers who questioned the motives of someone who had nearly died saving an American child. His words carried the moral authority of a father whose son was breathing because of Klaus's courage. Morrison retreated under the verbal assault, but his report would create problems that none of them could yet imagine. Klaus sensed the changing atmosphere immediately upon Morrison's departure. The American guards were more distant, their casual conversations replaced by professional formality. His fellow prisoners whispered warnings about drawing too much attention from camp authorities. The easy camaraderie that had developed with the Budro family was now viewed as potential evidence of collaboration rather than natural human connection. The heroism that had saved Anton's life was becoming a liability that threatened Klaus's safety within the prisoner community. Marie Budro made a decision that would have seemed impossible months earlier. She began preparing care packages for Klaus that went far beyond what regulations permitted, including homemade food, clean clothing, and small luxuries that acknowledged his sacrifice in ways that words could not express. Her actions were acts of rebellion against a system that would criminalize gratitude, that would transform kindness into evidence of enemy subversion. She no longer cared about military protocols or the opinions of neighbors who might disapprove. The packages created their own problems within Camp Polk. Other prisoners noticed Klaus receiving special treatment that they envied and resented. Some accused him of manipulating the American family for personal gain, of using his medical knowledge to create dependency that he could exploit. The criticism stung because Klaus knew that part of it contained truth. His relationship with the Budro family had indeed provided privileges that other prisoners lacked, even though those privileges had been earned through genuine sacrifice. Anton's reaction to the military investigation surprised everyone with its intensity. The 12-year-old boy who had been saved by Klaus's courage became a fierce defender of the German prisoner's character and motives. He confronted anyone who suggested that Klaus had ulterior motives, his young voice carrying conviction that shamed adults who questioned the purity of the rescue. His loyalty to Klaus became absolute, creating a bond that transcended the artificial categories of war. Dr. Thibodeaux found himself drawn into the controversy when military investigators questioned him about Klaus's medical knowledge and capabilities. They wanted to know if the German prisoner possessed skills that might be useful for sabotage or intelligence gathering. The doctor's responses were carefully measured, acknowledging Klaus's medical competence while emphasizing his ethical character and obvious dedication to healing rather than harming. His testimony would prove crucial in determining Klaus's fate. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate participants to include neighbors, local authorities, and anyone who had witnessed Klaus's behavior during his months of farm work. The portrait that emerged was of a young man whose actions consistently demonstrated compassion and integrity rather than the cunning manipulation that military intelligence suspected. Yet suspicion had taken root in ways that facts could not easily dislodge. Klaus began experiencing nightmares that reflected his growing anxiety about the investigation's potential consequences. He dreamed of being transferred to camps where hardcore Nazi prisoners would punish him for his obvious affection for Americans. He imagined Anton's family being prosecuted for their kindness to an enemy prisoner. The heroic moment that had defined his character was becoming a source of fear that poisoned his sleep and haunted his waking hours. The other German prisoners at Camp Polk were divided in their opinions about Klaus's situation. Some admired his courage and defended his actions as honorable regardless of nationality. Others worried that his prominence would bring unwanted scrutiny to all prisoners, potentially resulting in harsher treatment for everyone. A few suggested that he had violated his duty to Germany by risking his life for American interests. The debates reflected larger questions about loyalty and identity that war forces upon individual souls. Local civilian reaction to the investigation was overwhelmingly supportive of Klaus and critical of military authorities who would question such obvious heroism. Letters began appearing in regional newspapers defending the German prisoner's character and condemning bureaucrats who could not recognize genuine courage when confronted with it. The public sentiment created political pressure that military commanders could not ignore, though it also hardened their determination to maintain proper protocols. Klaus's relationship with Anton continued to deepen despite the official scrutiny surrounding their friendship. The boy had begun learning German with the intensity of someone who understood that language barriers were the only thing preventing deeper communication with his savior. Their conversations, conducted in a mixture of broken German and halting English, revealed Klaus's homesickness for his own younger siblings, and Anton's desperate need for the older brother figure that war had taken from him. The mechanical investigation into the cane press accident revealed evidence that supported Klaus's warnings about equipment failure. Engineers confirmed that the machine had been operating beyond safe parameters for weeks, that catastrophic failure had been inevitable rather than accidental. The findings vindicated Klaus's technical assessment while raising questions about why his safety concerns had been ignored by American supervisors more concerned with production quotas than worker welfare. Henry Budro began documenting Klaus's daily activities in a journal that she intended to present to military authorities as evidence of his character. Her observations painted a picture of a young man who consistently chose kindness over self-interest, who shared his meager possessions with less fortunate prisoners, who treated farm animals with gentleness that reflected his fundamental respect for life. The journal became her weapon against bureaucrats who would reduce heroism to suspicious statistics. The investigation reached a crucial turning point when Captain Morrison discovered evidence that contradicted his initial suspicions about Klaus's motives. Testimony from other prisoners revealed that Klaus had repeatedly refused opportunities to gather intelligence about local military installations, had actually discouraged fellow prisoners from asking questions about American defenses. His behavior pattern was consistent with someone who genuinely respected his captors rather than someone plotting against them. Henry Budro made an unprecedented decision to travel to Camp Polk and request a meeting with the camp commandant. His purpose was to provide personal testimony about Klaus's character and to challenge the military's right to criminalize heroism. The meeting would be the first time a local civilian had formally intervened on behalf of a German prisoner, setting a precedent that would influence how such cases were handled throughout the war. The commandant, Colonel Patterson, was a career military officer who had spent the war balancing security requirements against humanitarian obligations. Klaus's case presented him with a dilemma that had no clear resolution in military regulations. How do you maintain discipline among enemy prisoners while acknowledging acts of genuine heroism that transcend national boundaries? How do you prevent the exploitation of American kindness without criminalizing gratitude for life-saving courage? Klaus himself requested permission to address the investigation directly, to explain his actions in his own words rather than having his motives interpreted by others. His statement, delivered in carefully prepared English before a panel of military officers, would become one of the most moving testimonies about human nature during wartime that any of them had ever heard. His words would challenge their assumptions about enemies and allies, about the nature of courage and the meaning of loyalty in circumstances that reduce all pretense to its essential core. The hearing that would determine Klaus's fate was scheduled for September 15th, exactly 1 month after his heroic rescue of Anton. The intervening weeks had transformed a simple act of courage into a complex examination of military policy, human nature, and the possibility of finding common ground between supposed enemies. The outcome would determine not just Klaus's future, but the precedent for how American forces would handle similar situations throughout the remainder of the war. As the date approached, supporters and critics alike prepared their arguments for what had become a test case about the nature of heroism in wartime. The German prisoner who had risked everything to save an American child would soon discover whether his act of courage would be rewarded or punished by the very people whose child he had saved. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that Klaus might face consequences for demonstrating the kind of moral courage that America claimed to be fighting to preserve. The hearing room at Camp Polk had never witnessed anything quite like what unfolded on that September morning. Military tribunals were designed to handle clear-cut cases of discipline and protocol violations, not moral dilemmas that challenged the very foundations of wartime justice. Colonel Patterson sat behind a wooden table that had been hastily converted into a makeshift judge's bench, flanked by 2 other officers whose expressions revealed their own uncertainty about how to proceed. Klaus entered the room wearing his cleanest prisoner uniform, his posture straight despite the lingering effects of his injuries. The metal fragments had left visible scars on his shoulder and neck, physical reminders of the moment when he had chosen another person's life over his own safety. His eyes swept the room, taking in the formal military setting that would determine whether his act of heroism would be classified as commendable or suspicious. Henry Budro sat in the gallery beside his wife and son, their presence a powerful reminder of what was truly at stake in these proceedings. Anton clutched a hand-drawn picture he had made for Klaus, a crayon illustration of a man pulling a boy away from a dangerous machine. The simplicity of the child's artwork captured something that military regulations seemed incapable of addressing: the fundamental humanity of what had occurred in that cotton field. Captain Morrison presented his case with the methodical precision of someone who believed that military order depended upon maintaining clear distinctions between friend and enemy. His argument centered on the dangerous precedent that Klaus's actions might create if they were officially commended. Other prisoners might stage incidents to gain American sympathy. Security protocols could be compromised by emotional attachments between guards and prisoners. The entire prisoner of war system could be undermined by allowing personal relationships to override military discipline. The testimony that followed Morrison's presentation painted a more complex picture than his security concerns suggested. Fellow prisoners spoke about Klaus's consistent refusal to participate in escape planning discussions, his discouragement of anti-American sentiment among the German ranks, his voluntary assistance with camp medical emergencies that had saved both German and American lives. Their words revealed a man whose loyalties had evolved beyond simple nationalism to embrace a broader commitment to human welfare. Dr. Thibodeaux's medical testimony provided crucial context about Klaus's split-second decision during the mechanical failure. The physician explained how Klaus's positioning at the moment of crisis indicated that he had been monitoring the dangerous situation for several minutes before the catastrophic failure occurred. His rescue of Anton was not an impulsive reaction, but a calculated risk taken by someone with enough medical knowledge to understand the likely consequences of his actions. When Henry Budro took the stand, his testimony carried the moral weight of a father whose child was alive because of Klaus's courage. He described watching his son work alongside German prisoners day after day, observing Klaus's patient instruction and protective behavior toward a boy who reminded him of siblings left behind in Bavaria. Henry's words transformed the abstract concept of enemy collaboration into the concrete reality of human beings choosing compassion over convenience. Marie Budro's journal entries, read aloud during the proceedings, provided a detailed record of Klaus's daily interactions with the family and other prisoners. Her observations documented countless small acts of kindness that had gone unnoticed by military authorities focused on security protocols. The accumulated evidence painted a portrait of character that challenged every stereotype about enemy prisoners and their motivations. Anton's testimony was perhaps the most powerful moment of the entire hearing. The 12-year-old boy stood before the military tribunal and described in simple, direct language what it felt like to be saved by someone who was supposed to be his enemy. His words carried an innocence that cut through the complex military arguments surrounding Klaus's actions. He spoke of friendship that transcended uniform colors, of gratitude that knew no national boundaries, of trust that had developed through daily demonstrations of genuine care. Klaus's own statement, delivered in heavily accented but carefully prepared English, addressed the central questions about his motivations and loyalties. He spoke of his medical training and the oath to preserve life that had guided his actions since childhood. He described watching Anton work with dangerous machinery and feeling the same protective instincts he would have felt for his own younger brothers. His words revealed a man who had found a way to honor both his German heritage and his American friendships without betraying either. The cross-examination that followed Klaus's statement probed deeper into his background and beliefs. Military investigators wanted to understand how a German soldier could develop such obvious affection for American civilians while remaining loyal to his own country. Klaus's responses revealed the complex emotional landscape that war creates in individual hearts. He spoke of missing his family while caring for the Budro family, of serving Germany while respecting America, of maintaining his identity while adapting to circumstances no military training had prepared him to face. The proceedings were interrupted by an unexpected development that would influence the tribunal's final decision. A telegram arrived from the German prisoner of war camp in Mississippi reporting that Klaus's younger brother had been killed in action on the Russian front. The news transformed the hearing from an abstract discussion of military protocol into a deeply personal examination of loss and loyalty. Klaus received the devastating information with stoic dignity, but those present could see how the tragedy affected his testimony about family and sacrifice. Colonel Patterson called for a recess to allow Klaus time to process the news about his brother's death. During the break, something remarkable occurred that none of the military protocols had anticipated. Henry and Marie Budro approached Klaus not as representatives of an enemy nation, but as fellow parents who understood the pain of losing a child to war. Their comfort offered to a German prisoner in an American military tribunal represented exactly the kind of human connection that Captain Morrison had warned against. When the hearing resumed, Klaus's demeanor had changed in subtle but significant ways. The news of his brother's death had deepened his understanding of the Budro family's own losses, creating even stronger bonds of shared grief and mutual understanding. His final statements to the tribunal reflected this new awareness of how war affects families on both sides of the conflict. He spoke of honoring his fallen brother by choosing life over death, healing over harming, whenever circumstances permitted such choices. The deliberation that followed lasted 3 hours, during which the three-officer panel grappled with questions that had no clear answers in military law. How do you balance security concerns against moral imperatives? How do you maintain necessary discipline while acknowledging extraordinary circumstances? How do you prevent the exploitation of American kindness without criminalizing the very virtues that the war was supposedly being fought to preserve? The gallery remained packed throughout the deliberation, filled with local farmers, camp personnel, and German prisoners who understood that Klaus's case would establish precedents affecting all of them. The tension in the room reflected broader questions about how America should treat enemy prisoners who demonstrated genuine friendship and loyalty to their captors. The decision would influence policy at prisoner-of-war camps throughout the country. Colonel Patterson's announcement of the tribunal's decision came just as the afternoon sun began streaming through the hearing room's windows, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for the dramatic conclusion to Klaus's case. The colonel's words would be remembered and quoted for decades by military historians studying the complex moral landscape of World War II prisoner-of-war policies. The decision itself was as complex as the circumstances that had created the need for it. Klaus would not face disciplinary action for his rescue of Anton, but neither would his actions receive official military commendation. Instead, the tribunal established new guidelines for prisoner-civilian interactions that acknowledged the possibility of genuine friendship while maintaining necessary security protocols. Klaus's case had created a middle ground between suspicious surveillance and naive trust. The practical implications of the decision were immediately apparent. Klaus would continue working at the Budro farm, but under modified supervision that allowed for the human connections that had developed while preventing potential security breaches. Other prisoners throughout the camp system would benefit from the more nuanced understanding of loyalty and friendship that Klaus's case had established. The rigid categories of friend and enemy had been softened without being abandoned entirely. Klaus's reaction to the tribunal's decision revealed the depth of his emotional investment in the outcome. His relief was obvious, but it was tempered by grief for his brother and uncertainty about what the future would hold for his relationships with the American family who had become so important to him. The young German medic had discovered that heroism created its own complications, that saving a life opened doors that could never be completely closed again. The Budro family's response to the decision was one of quiet satisfaction rather than celebration. They had fought for Klaus not because they wanted to challenge military authority, but because they believed that courage deserved recognition regardless of the uniform worn by the person demonstrating it. Their victory was personal rather than political, focused on protecting someone who had protected them rather than making broader statements about prisoner-of-war policies. Anton's reaction was perhaps the most telling of all. The boy had never doubted that Klaus would be vindicated, his faith in justice reflecting the innocence that adults often lose in navigating complex moral landscapes. His continued friendship with Klaus would become a symbol of the possibility for genuine connection across artificial boundaries, proof that human hearts recognize courage and kindness regardless of the political circumstances that divide nations. The hearing's conclusion marked not an ending, but a transformation of Klaus's situation within the camp and the broader community. His heroic rescue of Anton had elevated him to a unique position among German prisoners, making him both an inspiration and a responsibility for military authorities struggling to balance security concerns with humanitarian values. The precedent established by his case would influence how similar situations were handled throughout the remainder of the war. Local newspaper coverage of the tribunal's decision focused on the human interest aspects of the story while carefully avoiding details that might compromise military security. Klaus's heroism was celebrated as proof of the fundamental decency that could emerge even in wartime circumstances, while his continued status as a prisoner of war reminded readers that friendship and enmity could coexist in the same individual relationships. The decision created ripple effects throughout the camp system as other commandants grappled with applying the new guidelines established by Klaus's case. Some welcomed the flexibility that allowed for human connections between prisoners and civilians. Others worried that such relationships would complicate their ability to maintain discipline and security. The debate reflected larger questions about how democratic societies should treat enemy prisoners while remaining true to their own values. Klaus himself began experiencing a different kind of burden, as word of his heroism spread beyond the immediate Louisiana community. He received letters from other prisoner families thanking him for demonstrating that German soldiers could be decent human beings. Some expressed hope that their own sons, captured in Europe, might receive similar kindness from their captors. The correspondence created emotional connections that extended far beyond the Budro farm. The mechanical failure that had precipitated Klaus's heroic rescue was ultimately determined to have been preventable through proper maintenance and safety protocols. New regulations were implemented requiring more frequent equipment inspections and giving prisoners authority to halt operations when they identified dangerous conditions. Klaus's technical warnings, initially dismissed by production-focused supervisors, became the foundation for improved safety procedures that would prevent similar accidents. Dr. Thibodeaux continued monitoring Klaus's recovery from his injuries while documenting the psychological effects of his heroic actions. The physician observed that Klaus seemed to carry himself with greater confidence and purpose following the tribunal's decision. His sense of identity had been strengthened rather than confused by the complex loyalties he had navigated during his testimony. The experience had clarified rather than complicated his understanding of his own moral compass. The other German prisoners at Camp Polk gradually accepted Klaus's unique position within their community, recognizing that his friendship with the Budro family did not diminish his connection to his fellow Germans. His ability to maintain relationships on both sides of the conflict became a source of hope for prisoners who worried that their own humanity was being eroded by the dehumanizing effects of captivity and separation from home. Marie Budro's care packages for Klaus continued, despite some criticism from neighbors who felt that such generosity toward an enemy prisoner was inappropriate. Her response was simple and direct. Klaus had saved her son's life, and no military regulation or social pressure would prevent her from expressing gratitude in whatever ways she chose. Her determination became an inspiration for other local families who had developed friendships with their German workers. The autumn harvest season brought new challenges and opportunities for Klaus and the Budro family to demonstrate that their relationship had survived the scrutiny of military investigation. Working together in the fields where Klaus had first proven his courage, they developed an even deeper appreciation for the bonds that crisis had forged between them. Their friendship had been tested by official suspicion and emerged stronger rather than weakened by the examination. Anton's English tutoring of Klaus accelerated as both found that shared language created deeper possibilities for communication and understanding. Their lessons became opportunities to discuss not just vocabulary and grammar, but the cultural differences and similarities that shaped their respective worldviews. The boy was teaching the German prisoner about America while learning about Europe through first-hand accounts that no textbook could provide. Klaus began keeping a journal of his own, documenting his experiences as a prisoner of war who had found unexpected friendship among supposed enemies. His writings revealed the complex emotional landscape of someone trying to remain loyal to his homeland, while developing genuine affection for his captors. The journal entries would later become valuable historical documents illustrating the human dimension of prisoner of war experiences during World War II. The approach of winter brought practical concerns about Klaus's continued assignment to farm work that would become less available during the cold months. Military authorities faced decisions about whether to transfer him to other duties or maintain his unique arrangement with the Budro family. The choice would test whether the precedent established by his case would survive changing circumstances and administrative convenience. The winter of 1943 arrived early in Louisiana, bringing with it a cold snap that transformed the humid cotton fields into frost-covered landscapes that Klaus had never expected to see in the American South. The temperature dropped so suddenly that the German prisoners found themselves unprepared for conditions that reminded many of them uncomfortably of the Russian front, where so many of their comrades had perished. But for Klaus, the changing season represented something more significant than mere weather. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in his relationship with the Budro family that would test the bonds forged in that moment of crisis. The reduced farm work created an unexpected opportunity that neither Klaus nor the Budro family had anticipated. With fewer daylight hours available for field labor and much of the heavy agricultural work postponed until spring, Klaus found himself with time to contribute skills that went beyond physical labor. His medical training, which had saved Anton's life during the mechanical disaster, now became valuable in addressing the chronic health problems that plagued rural Louisiana communities cut off from adequate medical care by wartime shortages. Marie Budro was the first to recognize the potential of Klaus's medical knowledge beyond emergency situations. Her elderly father-in-law, Henry's father Pierre, had been suffering from a persistent cough that had worsened throughout the autumn months. The nearest doctor was 20 miles away in New Iberia, and gasoline rationing made frequent trips impossible for non-emergency situations. When Marie tentatively asked Klaus to examine the old man, She was crossing another line that military regulations had never contemplated. Klaus's examination of Pierre Budro revealed symptoms that concerned him deeply. The persistent cough, accompanied by weight loss and night sweats, suggested tuberculosis, a disease that was claiming thousands of lives across rural America where medical care remained primitive and preventive measures were poorly understood. His diagnostic skills, honed through months of treating wounded soldiers in North Africa, allowed him to recognize patterns that might have been missed by less experienced practitioners. The diagnosis created a moral dilemma that extended far beyond the immediate medical concerns. Klaus possessed knowledge that could potentially save Pierre's life, but providing medical treatment to American civilians violated every protocol governing prisoner behavior. Yet allowing a treatable condition to progress toward a fatal outcome seemed to contradict the very medical oath that had guided his heroic rescue of Anton. The young German medic found himself once again choosing between regulations and conscience. Dr. Thibodeaux arrived at the Budro farm within hours of Klaus's urgent message, transmitted through channels that officially did not exist for communication between prisoners and civilian medical professionals. The physician's examination confirmed Klaus's diagnosis, while revealing the extent to which the German prisoner's medical expertise exceeded that of many American practitioners working in rural areas. The collaboration that developed between them would challenge assumptions about professional competence and national boundaries. The treatment plan that Klaus and Dr. Thibodeaux developed for Pierre required resources that were difficult to obtain in wartime Louisiana, but their combined knowledge created possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. Klaus's experience with respiratory conditions gained from treating gas attack victims complemented Dr. Thibodeaux's familiarity with local medical supply networks. Their partnership demonstrated how expertise could transcend nationality when human lives hung in the balance. Word of Klaus's medical capabilities spread through the local community, with the same speed that news of his heroic rescue had traveled months earlier. Families throughout Iberia Parish began requesting his assistance with medical problems that had gone untreated due to physician shortages and transportation difficulties. Each request created new challenges for military authorities trying to balance security protocols against obvious humanitarian benefits that Klaus's skills could provide. Captain Morrison found himself facing a situation that his security manual had never anticipated. The German prisoner who had once been suspected of potential espionage was now being sought after by American civilians for medical assistance that their own healthcare system could not adequately provide. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that Klaus had become more valuable to the local community than many of the American personnel assigned to monitor his activities. The requests for Klaus's medical assistance created practical problems that tested the flexibility of the precedent established by his tribunal case. How could military authorities allow a German prisoner to travel throughout the parish providing medical care while maintaining adequate security supervision? How could they deny life-saving treatment to American civilians simply because the person qualified to provide it happened to wear an enemy uniform? Colonel Patterson found himself once again grappling with questions that had no clear answers in military regulations. Klaus's medical activities were clearly benefiting American civilians in ways that strengthened rather than undermined the war effort. Yet allowing a prisoner such freedom of movement and influence within the local community violated fundamental security principles that existed for legitimate reasons. The balance between humanitarian concerns and military necessity had become even more delicate. The solution that emerged was characteristically American in its pragmatic approach to complex problems. Klaus would be allowed to provide medical assistance under the direct supervision of Dr. Thibodeaux, with American guards accompanying them on medical calls throughout the parish. The arrangement satisfied security requirements while acknowledging the reality that Klaus's expertise was saving American lives in ways that traditional military medical support could not match. Anton had become Klaus's unofficial medical assistant during these house calls, translating when language barriers created communication problems and helping to carry medical supplies that Dr. Thibodeaux and Klaus shared between them. The boy's pride in Klaus's healing abilities was obvious to everyone who witnessed their collaboration. He had discovered that the man who saved his life possessed skills that continued saving others throughout their community. The medical partnership between Klaus and Dr. Thibodeaux evolved into something that resembled a teaching hospital more than a prisoner supervision arrangement. The American physician found himself learning techniques that Klaus had developed while treating battlefield injuries under conditions that civilian practice rarely encountered. Klaus, meanwhile, gained knowledge about diseases and conditions that were common in Louisiana but unknown in his European experience. Their most challenging case came in December when a diphtheria outbreak threatened the children of 3 farming families living in the remote bayou regions south of New Iberia. The disease, which had killed thousands of American children before effective treatments were developed, required immediate intervention using antitoxin that was in critically short supply throughout wartime Louisiana. Klaus's knowledge of respiratory emergencies made him uniquely qualified to assist with treatment protocols that could determine whether the children lived or died. The journey into the bayou country tested everyone involved in ways that went far beyond medical challenges. The terrain was treacherous, accessible only by narrow boats that navigated channels through swampland that seemed designed to confuse and trap unwary travelers. Klaus found himself in an environment more alien than anything he had encountered in North Africa, yet his determination to reach the sick children motivated him through conditions that challenged his physical and emotional endurance. The families they were traveling to assist had never seen a German prisoner, had never imagined that an enemy soldier might be coming to save their children's lives. Their initial reaction to Klaus's presence mixed gratitude with confusion, as they struggled to reconcile his obvious dedication to healing with their preconceptions about German soldiers. The children, too sick to understand the political complexities of their situation, responded only to Klaus's gentle competence and genuine concern for their welfare. The medical treatment that Klaus and Dr. WW2 provided in those remote bayou cabins represented healing at its most fundamental level. Working by kerosene lamplight with limited supplies, and no possibility of evacuating critically ill children to better equipped facilities, they relied on skill, experience, and determination to combat a disease that had claimed thousands of young lives throughout American history. Klaus's battlefield medical experience proved invaluable in making life-and-death decisions with inadequate resources. The success of their treatment, with all 6 children eventually recovering fully from the diphtheria outbreak, created another wave of gratitude throughout the local community that further complicated Klaus's status as an enemy prisoner. The families whose children he had saved began sending letters of appreciation to military authorities, describing the German prisoners' dedication and skill in terms that challenged every stereotype about enemy combatants and their motivations. Dr. WW2's reports to military medical authorities about Klaus's capabilities began attracting attention from higher levels of command, who were struggling with physician shortages throughout the prisoner of war camp system. Klaus's combination of battlefield experience and genuine medical training made him potentially valuable for treating other German prisoners whose medical needs were often inadequately addressed by overworked American medical personnel. The proposal that emerged from these discussions would have seemed impossible months earlier. Klaus might be transferred to medical duties within the camp system, providing care for German prisoners while continuing his collaboration with American medical personnel. The arrangement would utilize his skills more effectively while addressing the chronic shortage of qualified medical support for the thousands of prisoners housed throughout Louisiana and neighboring states. Klaus's reaction to the proposed transfer was more complex than military planners had anticipated. His medical calling attracted him to opportunities for treating more patients and utilizing his skills more fully. Yet his connections with the Budro family and the broader Louisiana community had become central to his identity as a prisoner of war. Leaving them felt like abandoning the relationships that had given meaning to his captivity and demonstrated the possibility for human connection across enemy lines. The Budro family's response to the potential transfer was immediate and emphatic. They had no intention of losing Klaus to military bureaucracy that would relocate him based on administrative convenience rather than recognition of the bonds that had developed through shared crisis and mutual respect. Henry announced his intention to appeal directly to higher military authorities, while Marie began organizing community support for keeping Klaus assigned to local duties. Anton's reaction was perhaps the most telling of all. The boy who had been saved by Klaus's courage now faced the possibility of losing the mentor who had become like an older brother to him. His distress at the proposed transfer revealed how deeply the relationship had affected both participants. Klaus had found in Anton a reminder of the younger siblings he missed desperately, while Anton had discovered in Klaus the protective presence that war had taken from his own family. The community organizing effort that emerged around keeping Klaus in Louisiana demonstrated how completely his status had evolved from enemy prisoner to valued community member. Local farmers, medical professionals, and even some military personnel joined the campaign to prevent his transfer, arguing that his contributions to local welfare exceeded any benefits that might result from reassigning him to traditional medical duties within the prison camp system. The letters and petitions that flooded military headquarters painted a picture of a German prisoner whose impact on American civilian morale actually strengthened rather than undermined the war effort. Klaus had become living proof that individual Germans could demonstrate the democratic values that America claimed to be fighting to preserve. His transfer would send exactly the wrong message about how America treated those who chose cooperation over resistance. The debate over Klaus's future assignment reached levels of military command that rarely concerned themselves with individual prisoner cases. The publicity generated by his heroic rescue and medical activities had made him a symbol of successful prisoner rehabilitation that could not be relocated without generating negative publicity for the entire prisoner of war program. Yet security concerns about allowing prisoners too much freedom within civilian communities remained legitimate and troubling. Colonel Patterson found himself caught between competing pressures that reflected larger questions about American prisoner of war policies. Klaus had clearly demonstrated loyalty to American interests that exceeded that shown by some American civilians, yet military regulations existed for reasons that individual exceptions could not address. The precedent established by Klaus's case would influence how thousands of other prisoners were treated throughout the remaining years of the war. The decision about Klaus's future would ultimately depend on factors beyond his individual merits or the community support he had generated. Strategic considerations about prisoner utilization, security protocols that governed all prisoners regardless of their personal characteristics, and political concerns about public perception of prisoner treatment would all influence the final determination. Klaus had become larger than himself, a symbol of possibilities and problems that extended far beyond one German medic and one Louisiana family. As winter deepened into January 1944, the uncertainty about Klaus's future assignment created tension that affected everyone involved in his case. The Budro family faced the possibility of losing someone who had become central to their daily lives and emotional well-being. Klaus struggled with loyalty conflicts between his desire to serve where he was most needed medically and his commitment to the relationships that had transformed his understanding of enemies and allies. The resolution of Klaus's case would establish precedents that influenced American prisoner of war policies for the remainder of World War II and beyond. His story had evolved from a simple rescue into a complex examination of how democratic societies should treat enemy prisoners who demonstrate genuine friendship and valuable skills. The outcome would reflect America's understanding of its own values under the pressure of total war. The announcement of the final decision was scheduled for February 1st, exactly 6 months after Klaus's heroic rescue of Anton. The intervening months had transformed a mechanical accident into a test case about human nature, military necessity, and the possibility of finding common ground between supposed enemies. Whatever the decision, Klaus's impact on the Louisiana community and the American understanding of prisoner of war treatment had already become permanent and irreversible. Klaus Mueller remained in Louisiana for the duration of the war, continuing his medical work under the unprecedented arrangement that had grown from a split-second act of heroism. He saved dozens more lives throughout Iberia Parish, treating everything from childhood diseases to farming accidents with the same dedication he had shown when he threw himself between Anton and that spinning drive shaft. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Klaus faced a choice that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. He could return to a devastated homeland where everything he had known was destroyed, or he could attempt to build a new life in the country where he had discovered his truest self. The Budro family made the choice easy. Henry formally petitioned the immigration authorities to sponsor Klaus's permanent residency, arguing that the man who had saved his son deserved the chance to become an American citizen. Dr. Thibodeaux offered Klaus a partnership in his medical practice, recognizing that the young German's skills and compassion were exactly what rural Louisiana needed in the challenging years of post-war reconstruction. Klaus accepted both offers, understanding that his journey from enemy prisoner to American citizen represented something larger than his own personal transformation. Klaus married Marie Budro's youngest sister in 1947, settled permanently in New Iberia, and spent the next 40 years practicing medicine throughout southern Louisiana. He never forgot the moment when choosing courage over safety had changed not just Anton's life, but his own destiny. Anton grew up to become a doctor himself, inspired by the man who had saved him and then taught him that healing transcends every artificial boundary that humans create between themselves. The story of Klaus Mueller and the Budro family reminds us that even in our darkest hours, individual acts of courage can bridge any divide. When hatred seems to rule the world, when entire nations are consumed by conflict, there are still moments when the human heart recognizes no uniform, no flag, no enemy. Sometimes the most profound victories happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet seconds when one person chooses another's life over their own safety. In 1943 Louisiana, a German prisoner proved that heroism speaks a universal language, and that love really can bloom in the most impossible circumstances.